Let's begin by reviewing the word sustainable. It's a word that's typically seen today nearly everywhere. It's ubiquitous. But rarely, if ever, do I find that the word sustainable has food choice properly positioned in any sustainability efforts. For instance, for most, the word sustainable relates more to the energy sector or to waste or even to economic or social sustainability. The difficulty is that those all are important to understand, but the difficulty is that animal agriculture, specifically how it affects in terms of our environment, is the leading concern for our sustainability as a species, and also for sustainability of other species that we share this planet with. So not only has it become a concern that sustainability doesn't properly position livestock or animal agriculture in general into the equation, but so there's a disconnect there. But we're now moving into the direction of where we're placing more emphasis on fossil fuels and waste, and therefore the gap is becoming even greater. This is seen in an exaggerated sense with climate change, because the focus internationally has been that climate change is real and it's urgent, of course, but it's primarily related to fossil fuels, when in fact minimally 14.5% of all anthropogenic or human-induced greenhouse gas emissions are caused from the animal agriculture industry. And also typically the projections of those involved in climate change policymaking have ignored the component created by animal agriculture. So that, but the calculations are there that if in fact we eliminated all fossil fuel use today, we would still exceed our maximum amount of greenhouse gas emissions that is considered allowable in our atmosphere by the year 2050, just principally due to animal agriculture, primarily because livestock contribute over 7 gigatons of greenhouse gases per year and on their own, and it's expected to increase from 50% to 200% by the year 2050. So again, even if we eliminated all fossil fuel use today, we would still exceed our budget, what's allowed for the maximum amount of greenhouse gases in our atmosphere by the year 2050, just because of the production of livestock. So most climate change scientists agree that we need to drastically reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by the year 2020. And by drastically reduce, they mean by cutting in half. And we're at about 54 gigatons of greenhouse gases being emitted per year right now. And it's by all estimates, it seems nearly improbable, if not impossible, that we'll be able to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by half, because most of the focus, again, is on fossil fuels. But if we, for instance, there are models that exist today that display very clearly that if we simply converted all cropland that's currently being used to grow feed crops for livestock, and at the same time we converted all pasture land that's being currently used for grazing livestock in the world, we converted those lands to purely plant-based systems and agroforestry, meaning and because they're so efficient to use in terms of land efficiency, I mean, they can grow up to 20 to 50 times more food on 1 acre of land versus with plant-based foods versus with animal products. So because of their efficiencies, if we converted all those lands to purely plant-based systems for producing food for us to eat directly, there are models showing that all greenhouse gases produced by all sources today could be mitigated, meaning they would be sequestered into our soil without fossil fuels even be factored into the equation at all, just by changing the livestock patterns into plant-based systems. It's a pretty powerful statement. Additionally, our tropical rainforests and oceans are affected in climate change in ways that are detrimental long-term. For instance, our oceans produce over 50% of the oxygen that we breathe. Or rainforests, tropical rainforests in particular, especially in the Amazon area, produce over 20% of the oxygen that we breathe, and yet we're damaging both of those oxygenation systems and climate regulatory systems that we have because of our desire to produce food for us to eat from the animal agricultural sector. And specifically, when you're talking about livestock, they already comprise 45% of the entire land mass on Earth, and growing and raising livestock and then slaughtering them and eating them is producing greenhouse gases that are affecting not only our atmosphere, but they're then affecting our oceans, because our oceans are taking that excessive amount of carbon dioxide and warmth and trying to buffer it. And so our oceans have become more acidic and warmer at a faster rate, especially in terms of acidification, than they've become in the last 300 million years. Now, we are currently in overshoot mode with our planet, meaning that it would require about 1.6 Earth to sustain what we're currently taking from and doing to our planet. We've been in overshoot mode since 1973. And in the United States, it would require 5 full Earths to support our current lifestyle. And the single sector, the single reason for this unsustainability across all aspects of those measurable, quantifiable areas of, or concerns of unsustainability, the most single culprit responsible for our unsustainability is because of the food we eat. It's because of the livestock that we raise and eat on land, and because of the fish we're extracting out of our oceans and the habitat that we're destroying. So the single most important thing that we can do to ensure our sustainability on Earth for our species and other species that we share this planet with is to eliminate meat, dairy, and fish from our diet. Now, it has been over the years a topic that has been difficult to accept. It's been difficult to discuss by a number of authors and leaders in this area, or this concern, because it's been difficult from a cultural and society standpoint. It's been difficult to accept because it cuts through various cultural barriers. The difficulty that we have now, though, is that if we don't change our diets and do so very quickly, that it's creating this path, or this motion towards losing resources that sustain us. In fact, we've reached the Anthropocene era, where we've acquired the power to negatively change our biosphere, the litho and hydron atmosphere, the very environs that sustain us and sustain all other life on Earth. The difficulty is that we haven't acquired the maturity or the wisdom to manage this power in a beneficial or sensible manner. So my concern is that in the past, we have been looking at our diet or nutrition in terms of how it affects us as an individual. Or there's a solid movement in terms of animal welfare, animal rights, in terms of how our diet might affect those animals that we raise for food each year. But my concern is that we need to apply now. We need to apply the understanding that we have timelines, very recognizable timelines or tipping points that we're confronting, and we are now exceeding those timelines or tipping points. And the only way, the easiest way for us to manage that is to change our diet. In fact, there are 5 out of 9 recognized tipping points or planetary boundaries we've already surpassed. And those are the boundaries that a number of renowned international scientists have identified and quantified, where if we stay within these boundaries, human existence can prosper for generations to come. If we exceed these boundaries or these tipping points or timelines, then it changes our environment, likely irreversibly so in our lifetime, to where the risk of our sustainability or us living is to the point where we may perish. Many scientists feel that we only have 50 to 75 years even remaining. And that's because many of these boundaries have already been passed. The boundaries that we passed are with climate change and with land use or land system change, as well as some biogeochemical flows such as phosphorus and nitrogen, as well as our biosphere integrity and extinctions and ocean acidification. All those boundaries we have now passed and are irreversibly damaged in our lifetime. The difficulty is with the other 4 boundaries. All 9 boundaries are interconnected. All planetary boundaries are interconnected, and as one collapses, the others will soon follow. And we're moving quickly past the tolerance levels of the other 4 boundaries. In terms of our sustainability, then, there are a few different approaches, and many simply point their finger at overpopulation. And it's easy to do that because we have 7.4 billion people living on our planet today, with about 240,000 added every single day. So that's net. So control of our own human population is an issue, but it's not nearly so much of a problem as what we're doing to our planet. Another type of population, which is that we're raising and slaughtering and consuming 74 billion animals each year on our planet. And that number is growing each year. And that number is also on the light side, because on any given day, you may find up to, if you research the numbers correctly, especially in underdeveloped or developing countries, you would find that there are between 1.7 and 2 trillion chickens in the world, and between 1 and 3 trillion fish in the world that on their way, sooner or later, are off to slaughter that one year. Now, the connection between those numbers and our sustainability is the simple fact that in order to raise animals for us to then slaughter and consume, it requires resources. It requires land, it requires water, it requires air, and it requires, in many cases, fossil fuel. And so all of these resources combined is what's causing our state of unsustainability in a collective sense greater than any other industry that we have. So knowing that, again, it seems that the easiest solution to our sustainability problem is, continue decreasing our dependence on fossil fuel, continuing our need to reduce waste, but the method that we can best approach this in the most expedient way possible, because we're on these timelines and exceeding our tipping points, is to do something that's as quick as possible and in terms of a collective sense can create and generate the greatest amount of good for all humans and all beings that we share this planet with, and that is by eliminating, not reducing, but eliminating meat and dairy from our diet. Now, the reason that I stress the word elimination is because there are many food movements today that the media and the public and policymakers want to perpetuate, which are simply different versions of eat less meat or eat better meat in their eyes. And eating less meat is a very dangerous approach because there is no metric. There's no way to measure what less means. For instance, if there are 900 million people in the world suffering from hunger, which there are, and you are eliminating meat and dairy from the world and able to shift all the food patterns from animal agriculture to plant-based systems, world hunger could easily be eliminated. And that the metric can be zero. We want zero amount of people suffering in the world from hunger, and we want zero amount of unnecessary use of our resources. So eating less meat simply brings the metric into a very vague and difficult to quantify state, and also it continues the perpetuation towards these timelines that we're already on. A good example is the fact that the United Nations has supported and is perpetuating the belief that we just need to eat less meat, and so are a number of other organizations. But eating less meat is not consistent. Again, you can't measure it. There's no great metric there to eliminate something that's wrong, hurtful, or unnecessary, and which eating less meat is all those things. And so, and also it's inconsistent with the urgency and the magnitude of the problem, and it perpetuates irresponsibility. It also, eating less meat, the movement of eating less meat is simply mistakenly shifts the focus to seafood, because many people believe that seafood isn't meat, is not a real animal involved. So it's a very dangerous food movement. The reason that many food movements are inadequate, or they're not moving us in the right direction, is because most of these food movements, except for a fully whole food plant-based diet grown organically, any other food movement that incorporates animal agriculture into their systems is then incorporating, whether admittedly or not, they're incorporating inefficient use of our resources. And so, for instance, if you're buying local, transportation is only responsible for 4% of all the greenhouse gases emitted and all the fossil fuels used in the entire food production process. So buying local really isn't going to help in terms of all of the natural resources that are being depleted worldwide. And so I've always said that I'd much rather buy an organically produced plant-based product from 3,000 miles away than I would an animal product from my next door neighbor. And that's because of all the resource depletion that occurs by producing any type of animal product across the board, whether it's in land use inefficiencies or water use or production of methane or greenhouse gas emissions. So one other quick comment about that is that many people believe that if you shift your food focus from factory farming or industrial farming to grass-fed animal systems, that's going to solve the problem. In fact, it's going to make it worse, because there's more land use changes, there's more deforestation, there's more freshwater usage inefficiencies, and there's more greenhouse gas emissions, and so there's difficulty with that movement. In fact, a grass-fed cow consumes or produces 60 to 70% more methane than a cow that's fed grain. Also, it's been an arguable point unless you look at the facts, but grass-fed beef also consume more water than grain-fed, and that's because we're looking at water across the board: green water, blue water, gray water, all water types. And also, there's a feed conversion ratio issue. Grass-fed beef or cattle sometimes consumes a feed conversion ratio of 70 to 1, meaning it requires minimally 70 input units. Maybe it's pounds, whatever you want to look at it, kilograms, but essentially 70 to 1 is the feed conversion ratio for grass-fed beef, versus about 8 to 1 of grain-fed, versus 1 to 1 for plants. You just simply pluck the plant out of the garden and eat it yourself, and you have a 1-to-1 relationship. To expound a little about our timelines, or to emphasize them a little bit better and how they relate to our food movements, it's very important to understand that we need to do whatever we can to lessen our ecological footprint as quickly as possible, because we're in this overshoot mode, and again, we're demanding more of our planet's resources than what it can supply. And we're essentially borrowing resources from future generations, which I don't believe is ethical. So it brings up this other dimension of ethics. It's not really an issue of how we're treating domesticated animals so much as it is, and that's always been an argument, how the life and death, how we're treating in terms of the life and death of animals that we're raising and then slaughtering for food. But ethics takes on a much, much greater dimension. For instance, We need to apply ethics across the board to all biodiversity that we're affecting and all loss of all animals, whether they're wildlife or domesticated. And also we have to take into consideration how our choices are affecting future generations. We're essentially borrowing resources now that future generations will not have. And so with any food movement that continues perpetuating the livestock or fishing industries, the meat, dairy, fishing industries, basically any industry that perpetuates the use of animals to raise, slaughter, and then consume, or their products, is using resources inefficiently. So I like to term this more that we need to view it in terms of relative or optimal relative sustainability. That'll have to work because we need to look at how we best can use our resources. For instance, how can we best use our resources? Which resources will contribute the least to climate change? Which resources will be the best for our own human health? Which resources will use the least amount of, which food sources will use the least amount of our resources, and which are the most compassionate, all wrapped up into one package. So we especially need to look at this in terms of what animal product is then optimally relatively sustainable as compared to any plant-based foods. And that's the way we need to start viewing things as we start running out of resources and need to change our ways to create a more sustainable future. So any food movement that then has any type of animal product that's associated with it has some form of inefficiencies. And in the past, I would say, before 1973, when we started moving into an overshoot mode, I would say, well, this was less of a problem for most people looking at it. It would be more of an issue, what's on your plate in terms of animal welfare, what it's doing to our own human health. But as of today, the most important topic that we can possibly address is how we can create a state of sustainability. In fact, at this stage, I need to go one step further and say that we need to look beyond sustainability, that we need to start rejuvenating, regenerating our planet in various areas or geographical areas of our planet. And the only way to do this in as quickly as possible fashion would be by raising plant-based foods and by changing certain regions of the world to agroforestry, regions that can replace our soil, regenerate various aspects of our biosphere. The reason that sustainability is the most important topic that we can possibly address as a civilization is because today we're in what is termed an overshoot mode, meaning we're taking more of our planet's resources than what it can supply. In fact, today it would require approximately 1.6 Earths to sustain what we're currently taking from and doing to our planet in the United States. And in certain countries overseas, Australia and a few others, it would require 5 full Earths to support our current lifestyle. And the single industry, or the single sector most responsible across the board of all of our resources that are being depleted, as well as contributions to climate change, can be blamed squarely on animal agriculture. It's a single, even though other industries contribute to this picture, animal agriculture across the board is comprehensively the largest contributor to all aspects of our unsustainability. Whether we're talking about climate change, loss of fresh water or freshwater scarcity, land use changes, loss of biodiversity and rapid rate of extinctions, and our state of our oceans and loss of sea life and habitat, world hunger, our own human health, pollution, all those aspects of what I term global depletion related to our sustainability of our own species and other species. Animal agriculture is the largest single contributing industry to all those aspects of global depletion. One quick comment about topsoil. Today, there's a very large movement about how to replenish topsoil and how infertile our topsoil is. Well, over half of the topsoil on Earth has already been lost in certain regions, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, where we're doing some projects with some world hunger projects. More than 2/3 of the topsoil has been lost. Now, Typically, with many movements today, especially there's one in particular that is projected to help topsoil be replenished, and that's with grass-fed livestock, or something called permaculture, or carbon farming, Alan Savory's techniques, holistic management. There are a lot of different names for it, agroforestry, but with livestock. But essentially, we're going to be hearing more and more about these in the future, but essentially these are all movements, agricultural movements, to help support the livestock industry by the continuation of cattle and pigs and chickens on pastures, so that they feel that not only do we need those items from a human health standpoint, but more importantly with my topic, that it's needed from an environmental standpoint. And the fact remains is that the quickest way to regenerate our topsoil and to rejuvenate areas that have been desertified is by, again, reforesting them and with plant-based agricultural systems, and simply place indigenous species. And this has been done in a number of areas in the world, especially in the Amazon area, where certain areas have been desertified. And basically, it's bringing back life, bringing back topsoil, bringing back microclimates by reintroducing forests that have been cleared unnecessarily, primarily for livestock or for animal agriculture, or for crops to feed livestock elsewhere. One important point to note is that 45% of all the ice-free terrestrial landmass on Earth, 45% is used by livestock. And therefore, knowing that there's a significant resource depletion because of inefficiencies, that the easiest way to regenerate topsoil is simply to use land more efficiently. And many times it requires up to 20 times the land to produce the same amount of what some people would term as food from animal sources as it would from plant-based sources. Now, on any given area of land, you can produce 15 times more protein from plants as you can from animals. And it will, of course, plants will sequester greenhouse gas emissions rather than causing them. And plants typically will use, or animal systems will typically use 50 to 100 times more water in many cases than plant-based systems. A really good way to view this is to take 1 acre of soil and knowing that we're running out of land and we're running out of water and we're creating climate change, all parts of this unsustainability picture that we have. So how can we best use our land for food production, which is what we need to be viewing, how we need to be viewing this in the future. And a good way to look at this is to take 1 acre of land and to grow any food you'd like, and you'd have to ask yourself, what could you grow and what should you grow in the best interest collectively to reduce our collective footprint globally and in terms of ecological footprint. And if you took that 1 acre of land and tried to raise 1 grass-fed cow, first of all, 1 acre is not enough. The average would be 2 to 4. I've seen some that have required 50 acres to support one grass-fed cow. So if you take that acre and you try to raise 1 grass-fed cow, you'd end up with about 50 to 100 pounds of a food that's what you'd call food afterwards, that's then implicated in a number of Western disease states. You've also used about 1 million to 2 million gallons of water, and you've dumped about 6 to 7 tons of carbon dioxide and methane into the atmosphere, and you've also displaced other wildlife and biodiversity, versus using that land to grow something like kale, quinoa, fruit, nut, vegetable combination, and you've been able to grow maybe up to 20 to 50,000 pounds of food that's infinitely healthier for you to grow and for our planet, for you to eat, for our planet to grow. Yeah. One of the largest concerns that we have, most people are focused on climate change right now, if they are focused on any sustainability issue whatsoever. And climate change is important, but it's important to understand that climate change is an exacerbator. It takes events and makes them worse. If, for instance, we have a freshwater scarcity issue where the United Nations and other gold standard organizations are predicting that we are going to be in a 40% shortage of freshwater or freshwater scarcity. We're going to have a 40% shortage in freshwater by the year 2030. And it's been declared by the World Economic Forum that freshwater scarcity is, according to them, the #1 concern that we have as a civilization over the next 10 years. It's not climate change, it's from freshwater scarcity. And so then we have to view this as that, is it a scarcity issue, or it's how we're using our current resources, and especially fresh water. And one of the largest contributors to freshwater scarcity is animal agriculture. It requires a great deal of water to produce the animal product that's found on our plate. For instance, on average, it requires 2,500 gallons, between 1,800 and 25 gallons of water to produce 1 pound of beef, about 800 to 1,600 gallons, depending on who you're reviewing and what research you're reviewing, to produce 1 pound of pork, and about 500 to 800 gallons to produce 1 pound of chicken, and it requires a fraction of that, sometimes up to 1/50th of that, to produce 1 pound of a plant-based product. So also you combine this with the fact, the inefficiencies, you combine that with the fact that 27% of all the fresh water consumed in the world is being used by livestock. So it seems that, the easiest manner, the quickest manner in which we can reduce our water footprint as part of our ecological footprint is to simply choose those foods that use the least amount of water, the least amount of land, produce the least amount of greenhouse gases in terms of climate change contribution, and at the same time are the healthiest for us to consume and displace the least amount of biodiversity or other species that we share this planet with. As we view food, I think we need to be looking at our responsibility as stewards of this planet. For instance, if we are in an overshoot mode, using more of our planet's resources than what it can supply, it seems that it's in our inherent duty to do what we can to reduce that footprint and do it in the quickest way possible. What we have to do then, I believe, is to start looking at things outside of self, outside of how its effect directly on us. For instance, we can't really force somebody to change their dietary patterns to reduce their own risk of heart disease. We can't really force somebody to do that, and we can't really force anybody to be empathetic in terms of their concern for the infliction of pain on other beings, other animals that we slaughter. Whether they're grass-fed or not, they still go through the same slaughtering process. And I'm talking about fish as well as any other type of species that we happen to consume. So I think it's time we start looking outside of self, because the fact is that whether you or I want to change for our own sake, we now have to change for other individuals, other people in our civilization, and other beings' sake. And otherwise, we are creating mass extinctions, and we're creating massive loss of biodiversity, and we are jeopardizing our own future as a species. In fact, we're losing other species at a rate of about 1,000 to 10,000 times the background rate, that which we've seen for the previous several thousands of years, which used to be about 2 to 4 species going extinct per year. Well, scientists have basically stop trying to estimate the exact number of species going extinct per year, because there's so many. Now it's just the rate of extinction, because we're losing so many species. And most scientists agree that the principal reason for rapid rate of loss of species and biodiversity, this rapid rate of extinction that we haven't seen since the dinosaurs were lost 65 million years ago, most scientists are in agreement that the single principal reason across the 5 leading drivers of species loss, meaning loss of habitat, and invasive species. And there are 5 main drivers. The leading cause of all 5 drivers combined is animal agriculture, livestock on land, and by overfishing in our oceans. Let's talk briefly about our oceans. Our oceans are in a very, very damaged state. They're being destroyed at a rate that is become irreversible in certain aspects in our lifetime. There are 3 principal reasons our oceans are being destroyed, or 3 principal ways, 1 principal reason. The ways that they're being destroyed are by warming and acidification, by pollution, and also by loss of species, loss of habitat. And all 3 ways that our oceans are being destroyed have the consistent weaving of one thread through all of them, and that is what we can find on our plates. For instance, what we eat on land, our raising and slaughtering of livestock on land, is creating warming and acidification of our oceans by way of greenhouse gas emissions. And our raising and eating livestock on land is causing more than 550 nitrogen-flooded dead zones around the world, comprising 95,000 square miles of areas completely devoid of life. So any meaningful discussion of the state of our oceans has to begin with frank discussions about land-based animal agriculture. But it is really fishing that is the largest contributor to our demise of our oceans by itself as one entity. And that's because whether we have climate change or not, we are depleting our oceans in terms of the sea life that's located and habitat that is needed for our sea life. We're depleting those at rates where it's predicted by most scientists that nearly all commercially recognized sea life in our oceans will be collapsed by way of collapse of their own systems by the year 2048, whether climate change is in the picture or not. And that's principally because of our desire to eat fish. We're destroying habitat by the mechanisms of fishing, whether it's purse seine or long line or trawling, bottom trawling, or gill net, or poisons or explosives. There's so many different methods of destroying fish and destroying habitat while they're fishing. But it's also by extracting, or what they call harvesting, target fish. That's the fish that you want to eat on your plate. Target fish are becoming extinct, and then the next fish in line are being fished, the next fish in line in terms of commercially desirable fish species. And so we're creating this cascade effect of exploiting species up and down the food web because of our desire to eat whatever target fish is on the menu. Over 90% of all large fish species are gone. For instance, tuna, cod, halibut, pollock, salmon, krill, menhaden. There's so many different types of fish species that both large and small fish species that are now reaching the point where between 75 and 95% of their species is gone. It's been exploited, and they are already on the verge of collapse. Of the 17 major fishing stock areas in the world, all of them are either on the verge of collapse or have already collapsed or are damaged heavily because of overfishing. Over 1,000 species that have been studied have over 87% of those 1,000 species studied are now in a state of decline and damage from overfishing practices. I like to term our fishing practices in our oceans more as the problem is more related to fishing than the term overfishing. I think overfishing is a term that could be applied fairly accurately in the early to mid 1800s, whereas today any type of fishing, whether it's commercially in the open seas or in our reef systems or in the EEZ, the Economic Exclusive Zone, which is about a 200-mile zone away from, out from countries that they are allowed to fish. Regardless of where the fishing occurs, it's exploiting species to the point where they're damaged and they will likely not recover in our lifetime. And the other, in fact, it was two important reports were just released in the last year indicating that the previous calculations of the amount of fish that have been extracted from our oceans were underestimated by the United Nations. They were underestimated in terms of commercial fishing, but they were also underestimated in terms of indigenous people, in terms of how they're fishing around their own reef systems, sometimes destroying complete populations of various fish in these reef systems. You know, I visited Hawaii not too long ago and was asked to speak to their Senate regarding their ecological, their environment situation. And Hawaii is a very beautiful state, obviously, but their economic and ecological connection is basically a mess. They import over 90% of their food at a tune of about $3 billion per year. And the reason they're doing that is because they've run out of land to grow food, and they've run out of fish in their oceans. 75% of the indigenous fish species around the reefs of Hawaii have declined by 75%. Over 90% of most of the fish species in all their islands have been lost. And on land, between 80 and 87% of all of their agricultural land is used for livestock, mostly grass-fed livestock, which is creating food for them at a tune of about, at a rate of about 40 to 50 pounds per acre, instead of using their land for plant-based alternatives. So I view Hawaii as a small example of planet Earth in terms of the only difference is that in terms of running out of their resources because they're using them inefficiently. They're overfishing their reef systems, and therefore they're in serious decline, likely irreversible in our lifetime, and they have run out of land in their islands to produce food for their own human population. And this is no different than we are on planet Earth. The main difference is that Hawaii is just a little ahead of us in terms of the visibility of their difficulty. And secondly, Hawaii can import food right now from another source, whereas we don't have that luxury on planet Earth. Because of our current state of unsustainability, I believe, especially when we're speaking about ecological terms and the need to reduce our footprint ecologically, I feel there's going to be a strong need very soon, needs to be enacted in the next year, to have an eco and health risk tax. And the reason is because the resources that we've been using have never been paid for. The value of our ecological, of our ecology, the value of our natural resources have never had a price tag associated with them. So we've been using them as if they're free, and in fact they're not free. Let's look at water alone. Although water on Earth remains, the amount of water on Earth remains constant, the consumptive form it happens to be in is not. So as we use fresh water, especially out of our ancient aquifer systems, they're being depleted at rates that we can't replenish them in our lifetime, especially various ancient aquifers in California, the Central Valley, the Ogallala, and the Corn Belt. These are areas where they're heavily involved in agriculture and heavily involved in livestock. So they're using our water systems at a much greater rate than what they should be if they're using plant-based systems. But there are also other aquifers that are being used at a rate that is not going to be replenished in our lifetime. So I feel there needs to be, whether you apply it through water or any other type of resource that we're plundering, there has to be some form of taxation. You can call it incentivizing to soften it. But basically, the approach to how we can become more sustainable has to be made through not only education, through grassroots efforts. We have to lift ourselves up in terms of enlightenment, but we also have to create some form of taxation, and I would call it an eco and health risk tax, because we've never really paid for the services that we've used as we eat, before we eat the food, in terms of how to produce it and what resources are used. And we also don't pay for those risk factors that occur after we eat this food, increasing the risk of the 5 most common diseases in Western society and cancers. So I feel that there has to be some economic correlation between this, because our heads have always been turned in the other direction. We've always looked the other way and never wanted to pay for these resources. As we understand more about our relationship with our resources, our natural resources, and planet Earth, which sustains all of us and nourishes all of us, we do need to understand that as individuals, it won't matter how healthy we are if our planet isn't healthy. And the more we understand this, and the more we realize that we're in this overshoot mode, demanding more of our planet's resources than what it can supply, the more dismal things can seem, the more gloomy the picture is. But there is something that we can all do about this. We can change this around. Are we losing habitat and are we losing species as I speak here? Yes, we are. But we can change this. We can change it to the point where future generations will have a sustainable environment for themselves to help sustain them. We can change it so that we can save species on Earth. We can save our own species, we can save other species. We can do this in terms of educating. We need to create educational avenues. We can do this by educating the educated. We can educate those in academic positions and those funders in business situations to make them more aware about the connection between food choice and our environment and sustainability. And importantly, there is hope, because all of us can do something today. We can all save lives immediately. We can all be heroes. We can all be superheroes. We can all essentially save lives and save our planet, save resources with every single thing that we eat every single day. We just have to change it over immediately to whole food, plant-based systems, especially those that are grown organically. We will save resources, we will save lives, and we need to impress this upon our youth. We need to impress it upon all those around us, and we need to be examples, because the future to our society is held by all of us. The key is what we find on our plates.